The sun was beginning its descent behind the hills that cradled Eldridge Hollow, casting long shadows across the sleepy town. Eldridge Hollow was a quaint place, untouched by time and the busy clamour of city life. Its streets were lined with old brick buildings and charming Victorian homes, each holding a story as old as the town itself. The townsfolk lived simple, quiet lives. Beneath the surface of this idyllic setting, there lay whispers of something more, something ancient, and not entirely of this world. Among the residents were 4 teenagers, each born and raised in the town, yet each feeling the restlessness and curiosity that comes with youth. Emma, with her bright red hair and inquisitive green eyes, was the unofficial leader. She was known for her fearless nature and insatiable thirst for adventure. Lucas, her childhood friend, was more reserved, his thoughtful demeanour often leading him to caution. Zoe, newest addition to their group, had moved to the Eldridge Hollow only a year or 2 ago. She brought with her her sense of mystery and an air of the big city that fascinated the others. Lastly, there was Michael, the jokester, always ready with a quip or a prank, but hiding a keen intelligence behind his playful exterior. On this particular evening, the group found themselves gathered at Emma's house, sprawled out in her attic. The walls were adorned with posters of rock bands and old movie stars, and the floor was a mess with cushions and blankets. As the sun set, their conversation turned, as it often did, to the legends of Eldridge Hollow.
The forest,
Lucas said, his voice dropping to a whisper.
They say it's cursed, that those who enter don't return the same, if they return at all.
Zoe leaned forward, her dark eyes sparkling with intrigue.
Come on, that's just an old wives' tale, right? Every town has its ghost stories.
Emma grinned, picking up an old book from beside her.
Not just stories. This.
She tapped the book.
Is a journal from the town's founder. It mentions the forest and something else.
Michael scoffed playfully.
What? A secret clubhouse for the town elders to play dress up and scare kids?
Ignoring Michael's jest, Emma opened the book to a well-worn page. The handwriting was faded, but the words were clear enough.
It speaks of a chapel in the heart of the forest, where the town's founders practiced unusual rituals.
The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Lucas frowned, unease flickering in his eyes.
That sounds like a bad idea, messing with stuff we don't understand.
But Emma's adventurous spirit was airtight.
Isn't that more reason to check it out? We'll just take a look during the day. We don't have to go in or anything.
Zoe nodded enthusiastically.
I'm in. It sounds exciting. Plus, I could use some material for my blog.
Michael grinned, clapping his hands together.
Looks like we have a plan. The adventurers of Eldridge Hollow strike again.
Lucas sighed, knowing he was outnumbered.
All right, but we're just looking, nothing more.
The next day, the group set out for the forest. It loomed at the edge of the town, a vast expanse of ancient trees and entangled undergrowth. As they approached, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of the town faded away, replaced by the hushed whispers of the forest. As they stepped into the shadowy embrace of the forest, an inexplicable chill ran down their spines. The woods were alive with an unnatural stillness, as if the very trees were holding their breath, watching the intruders with unseen eyes. The light that filtered through the dense canopy was dim, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. Emma led the way, her unusual confidence slightly dimmed by the oppressive atmosphere of the forest. Lucas followed, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a mix of fear and fascination. Zoe, ever the brave one, tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but her voice sounded hollow and out of place in the silent woods. Michael, usually the most boisterous, was unusually quiet, his usual bravado replaced by a growing sense of unease. As they ventured deeper, the forest seemed to change around them, their branches intertwining above like skeletal hands. The ground was littered with fallen leaves and twigs that crunched eerily underfoot. Occasionally, a distant rustling or the snap of a twig would startle them, sending shivers down their spines.
It feels like we're being watched.
Zoe whispered, her eyes darting nervously around. Lucas stopped, his gaze fixed on something ahead.
Do you see that?
He pointed towards a series of carvings on the trees. They were symbols, unlike any they had seen before, ancient and sinister. The group gathered around, examining them with a mix of curiosity and dread.
These don't look like any natural markings or graffiti.
Emma observed, her fingers tracing the strange symbols.
They're too deliberate, too purposeful.
Suddenly, a low moan echoed through the forest, freezing them in place. The sound was otherworldly, a mournful cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The teens exchanged frightened glances, the reality of their situation sinking in.
Maybe we should head back.
Michael suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. Before they could decide, a thick fog began to roll in, enveloping them in a ghostly blanket. The path they had come from was quickly obscured, and the forest around them became a maze of shadows and confusion. Panic set in as they realized they were lost, an eerie symbol on the tree now mocking reminders of their folly. As they wandered aimlessly, trying to find a way out, the forest seemed to close in on them. The trees appeared to bend and twist, their branches clawing at the air. The fog distorted sounds, making it impossible to tell direction or distance. Every so often, they would catch a glimpse of figures moving in the mist, just at the edge of their vision, too quick to be seen clearly. Emma tried to keep a brave face, but her voice betrayed her fear.
We need to stick together. If we keep moving, we'll find our way out.
But the forest had other plans. Whispers seemed to float in the air, unintelligible, yet unmistakably human, as if the forest itself was speaking to them. The ground beneath them felt alive, uneven and shifting, making every step a struggle. In a clearing, they came across an old moss-covered statue. It was a figure, neither human nor animal, its features worn away by time and nature. The statue seemed to gaze upon them with a malevolent intent, its presence adding to the growing terror.
It's like we've stepped into another world.
Zoe murmured, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. The sun was setting, and the forest grew darker, the shadows more menacing. They realized with a sinking heart that they would have to spend the night in this haunted place, surrounded by the unknown and unseen. As they huddled together, trying to find some comfort in each other's presence, the forest around them whispered and moaned, a lullaby of ancient fears and forgotten nightmares. As the evening shadows grew longer and the light dimmed, the forest around them took on an even more sinister aspect. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches casting grotesque shapes on the ground. Emma tried to keep her voice steady.
We should make camp here. It's too risky to move around in the dark.
Lucas nodded in agreement, though his eyes darted nervously around.
Yeah, but let's keep the fire small. We don't want to draw attention.
As they settled down, the eerie noises of the forest intensified. The rustling of leaves and the creaking of branches seemed deliberate, as if something was moving just beyond their line of sight. Zoe hugged her knees, her voice quivering.
Do you think it's just animals out there?
Michael, staring into the fire, replied,
I don't know, Zoe. This place doesn't feel right. It's like it's alive, watching us.
The group sat in tense silence, the crackles of the fire punctuating the oppressive stillness of the forest. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of the wind sent chills down their spines. Lucas broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper.
Do you hear that? It's like whispering.
Emma strained to listen, and sure enough, amidst the natural sounds of the forest, there was something else. A low, unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from all directions. Zoe's eyes widened.
It sounds like someone's talking, but I can't make out the words.
Michael shook his head in disbelief and fear.
This can't be real. It's just our minds playing tricks on us.
But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be calling to them, beckoning them deeper into the forest's heart. The group huddled closer to the fire, the only source of comfort and safety in the encroaching darkness. As the night wore on, their fears escalated into terror. Visions plagued them, glimpses of shadowy figures moving between the trees, the sensation of being touched by unseen hands, the feeling of being watched by malevolent eyes. Emma tried to rally their spirits.
We can't let this get to us. We have to stay strong, stay together. We'll make it through the night.
But as the hours passed, their resolve began to crumble. Paranoia crept in, each noise, each movement, fueling their imagination with horrifying possibilities. The forest, with its ancient and unknowable presence, seemed to be playing a cruel game with their minds. Lucas, his voice shaking, summed up their plight.
It's like we're in a nightmare, but we can't wake up.
As dawn finally approached, bringing with it a faint glimmer of light, the group was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The night had taken its toll, leaving them frayed and vulnerable. The forest, however, remained unchanged, its secrets hidden behind a veil of leaves and shadows, waiting to challenge them further as they continued their desperate quest for a way out. The light of a new day did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere of the forest. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their branches intertwining above like the fingers of a giant hand. The path, if it could be called that, was barely discernible, more a series of less dense patches between the undergrowth.
We need to keep moving,
Emma insisted.
If we stay here, we're sitting ducks for whatever's out there.
Lucas, squinting in the dim light, nodded in agreement.
Let's head towards that rise over there. We might get a better view of where we are.
As they trudged on, the forest seemed to reluctantly give way, the underbrush becoming less dense, the trees less foreboding, and then, almost without realizing it, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center, particularly hidden by the overgrowth and the passage of time, stood an old chapel. The chapel was in stark contrast to the surrounding wilderness. Its stone walls were crumbling, and the ivy clung to its surfaces, but it stood defiantly, a testament to time long forgotten. The wooden door was ajar, hanging off its hinges, inviting, yet foreboding.
This has to be it.
Zoe whispered, a mix of awe and fear in her voice.
The chapel from the legends.
They approached cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at them. Inside, the chapel was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay and old stone. Faded pictures adorned the walls, depicting scenes that were both beautiful and horrifying. Rituals, sacrifices, and the beings that were neither human nor divine. Scattered around the floor were artifacts, old, rusted tools, books with pages yellowed by age, and strange symbols etched into the metal and wood. In the center of the room, a stone altar stood, stained with what could only be decades, if not centuries of use. Lucas picked up one of the books, his hand trembling slightly.
These symbols, they're the same as the ones we saw in the forest.
Emma, examining a strange metallic object, said,
This place, it's been here all this time, hiding its secrets.
Michael, who had been quiet since entering the chapel, suddenly spoke up.
Guys, look at this.
He was standing by a wall where a large tattered parchment hung. It was a map of the forest, with the chapel marked at the center. Surrounding it were more symbols and notes written in a language they couldn't understand.
This is it.
Emma said, a sense of realization in her voice.
This chapel, these symbols, they're not just part of the forest's history. They're part of whatever's happening to us.
The discovery marked a point of no return. The mysteries of the forest were no longer just legends and stories. They were real, and they were more terrifying and profound than any of them could have imagined. As they left the chapel, they knew that their journey through the forest was far from over. The secrets they had uncovered were just the beginning, and the true nature of their ordeal was yet to reveal itself. But as they stepped back into the forest, the light of dawn seemed to retreat, the shadows lengthening once again. The forest, with its newly revealed secrets, seemed to watch them, its whispers carried on in the wind, a warning, a challenge, a beckoning into the unknown. As dusk settled over the forest, casting long shadows that merged with the growing darkness, an unsettling transformation began. The teens, already deeply unnerved by their findings in the chapel, felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The air turned colder, biting at their skin, and a thick, clinging fog rolled in, shrouding the trees and obscuring their path. The forest, once merely a place of mystery, now felt like a living, breathing entity, watching them with unseen eyes. Emma stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. She squinted into the fog, certain she had seen a shadow move just beyond their line of sight.
Did you see that?
She whispered, her voice laced with fear. The others gathered close, peering into the dense mist, but saw nothing except impenetrable fog.
We need to keep moving.
Lucas urged, trying to mask his own fear.
If we stay out here, we're vulnerable. We need to find shelter.
Guided by Lucas's sense of direction, they cautiously moved through the forest. The undergrowth seemed to grasp at their ankles, and the fog played tricks on their eyes, creating illusions of figures and faces in the shifting mists. The eerie silence was broken only by their own footsteps and the occasional distant sound that could have been an animal or something else. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon an old cabin. Its appearance was forlorn as the forest itself. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung precariously off its hinges. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with a scent of mould and decay. It was far from welcoming, but it offered a temporary refuge from the unsettling embrace of the forest. The night was a relentless ordeal. Every creak of the cabin's time-worn structure, every rustle outside its walls, set their nerves on edge. Sounds seemed to surround them, a shuffling just outside the cabin, a faint whispering as if the fog itself was speaking. Lucas tried to rationalize it as the wind or animals, but the fear in his eyes told a different story. The feeling of being watched was constant, oppressive. It was as if the forest itself was aware of their presence, curious and malevolent. Emma, huddled with the others, felt a chill that went beyond the cold air. It was a primal fear, a sense that they were not alone, that they had intruded into a realm that was not their own. As the hours ticked by, the line between reality and imagination blurred. Shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, and the fog pressed against the windows like grasping fingers. In the heart of the forest, under the cover of night, the entity they had unwittingly awakened began to stir, its presence a looming threat in the darkness. Back in the town, a sense of foreboding had settled over the residents as night approached. The parents of the missing teenagers were fraught with worry, their fears amplified by the ominous forest and fog that had bordered the town. It was Nathan, Emma's older brother, who finally decided to act. His memories of the forest were tinged with the fear-laden stories he had heard as a child, stories he had dismissed until now. Gathering in the town square, Nathan addressed a group of concerned townsfolk.
We need to find them before this fog gets any worse.
he urged, his voice firm despite the anxiety gnawing at him. The volunteers, a mix of worried parents and brave souls, nodded in agreement, although apprehension was clear in their eyes. Equipped with lanterns, flashlights, and a determined spirit, the search party ventured into the forest. The familiar paths and clearings of the daytime were now transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and uncertainty under the cloak of night. The trees seemed to close in around them, and an unsettling silence pervaded the air, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Nathan led the group, calling out for Emma and her friends, his voice echoing eerily in the stillness. The deeper they ventured, the more he felt the oppressive weight of the forest, as if it were a living entity that resented their intrusion. Memories of old tales surfaced in his mind, tales of spirits and entities bound to the forest, of people who entered and never returned. The search party moved cautiously, their lights casting ghostly beams through the mist. At times they thought they saw movements in the shadows, or heard whispers carried on the wind, but nothing materialized. The forest seemed to be playing tricks on them, distorting their senses and leading them in circles. After several hours of fruitless searching, frustration and fear began to set in. The realization that they were not merely searching for the teenagers, but also battling an unseen and unknown force, was deeply unsettling. Nathan tried to maintain a semblance of hope, but the stories he had once scoffed at now seemed all too real. As the night progressed, the forest grew denser, the trees more gnarled and menacing. The path that they had been following disappeared, leaving them disorientated and lost. The reality of their situation was clear. They were not just searching for the missing teens, they were struggling for their own survival against an ancient and malevolent spirit of the forest. Back in the cabin, as the group huddled together for warmth and comfort, their discovery of the old book continued to cast a shadow over them. The ancient, leather-bound tome, with its pages yellowed by time, seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. Hesitantly, Emma opened it again, her fingers tracing over the strange symbols and cryptic text. The more she read, the clearer the horrifying truth became. The book detailed a ritual, a ceremony that was to be performed every 50 years to appease an entity known as the Guardian of the Forest. The date mentioned was no mere coincidence. It was the very night they were stranded in the forest.
The ritual, it requires a sacrifice.
Emma's voice trembled as she translated the old text.
Something of immense personal value must be offered to the Guardian.
Michael, his face pale in the flickering candlelight, swallowed hard.
Are we supposed to be the sacrifice? Is that why we're here?
Zoe, her eyes wide with fear, flipped through the pages, searching for more information.
There's more here about the Guardian. It says it's a protector of the forest. But if angered, it can bring ruin and madness.
The realization that they were potentially caught in an ancient and possibly deadly tradition was both terrifying and surreal. They were no longer mere intruders lost in the forest. They were unwitting participants in a ritual that had been going on for centuries. Lucas, trying to keep a logical perspective, speculated.
Maybe this is all just coincidence. We can't really believe in some ritual sacrifice.
But the eerie atmosphere of the cabin, coupled with the unexplainable events they had already experienced, made his skepticism sound hollow, even to his own ears. The night outside grew wilder, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls. The cabin creaked and groaned under the force, as if echoing the turmoil within its walls. The group sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the gravity of their situation. As they pored over the book, searching for any clue that might help them, the forest seemed to press in closer, as if eager to reclaim its secrets. The notion that they were there on the exact date of the ritual heightened the tensions, casting a shadow of impending doom over them. They knew they could not ignore the possibility that the ritual and the guardian were more than just myths. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but palpable, was what would happen if the ritual was not completed, and whether they would survive the night. As the night deepened within the confines of the old forest cabin, a sinister transformation begun. A refuge they had sought now felt like a cage, with its walls that seemed to pulsate with a life of their own. Shadows cast by the flickering candlelight danced across the room, taking on grotesque and menacing forms. The first indications of the supernatural assault was subtle, yet unnerving. Emma, peering out of the misty window, caught a glimpse of what appeared to be the eyes, glowing, malevolent eyes, staring back at her. She blinked, and they vanished, leaving her with a chilling sense of being watched by an unseen entity. Lucas, ever the rational one, tried to dispel the growing fear.
It's just our imagination, heightened by the situation,
he suggested, his voice betraying a hint of doubt. But his words brought little comfort, as the cabin seemed to come alive with unexplained phenomena. Whispers and groans emanated from the walls, creating a symphony of eerie sounds that unnerved them to their core. Zoe, her voice trembling, whispered,
It's like the forest itself is speaking to us, reaching into our minds.
The manifestations grew increasingly terrifying. Shadows in the room twisted into humanoid shapes, contorting in impossible ways. The howling wind outside morphed into voices, a chorus of despair that whispered secrets and fears directly into their minds. Michael, typically the joker of the group, was reduced to a state of silent horror.
This can't be real.
He muttered repeatedly, as if trying to convince himself rather than his friends. The apparitions became more tangible. A figure appeared briefly in the corner of the room, its form blurry and distorted. When Emma aimed her flashlight at it, it disappeared, leaving a frigid patch of air and an oppressive feeling of malevolence. Throughout the night, these encounters escalated. Shadowy figures could be seen pacing outside the cabin, and the sensation of unseen hands touching them became more frequent. Disembodied voices echoed around them, each uttering their deepest fears and regrets, things that had never been spoken aloud. The psychological impact was immense. Each member of the group felt their sanity fraying at the edges. The forest, with its ancient guardian, was not merely a physical presence. It was an entity that invaded their minds, feeding off their terror and confusion.
The forest is trying to break us.
Lucas murmured, his voice barely audible over the symphony of whispers and moans.
It's not just about getting lost in the woods, it's about getting lost in ourselves.
As they huddled together, their minds assaulted by the horrors around them, a realization dawned. The supernatural forces at play were not just random manifestations, they were targeted, calculated to exploit their individual fears and weaknesses. Emma, her resolve hardening, spoke up.
We can't let it win. We have to fight back, even if it's just by holding on to who we are, holding on to each other.
The night seemed to stretch into an eternity, each hour marked by escalation of terror. The apparitions grew bolder, the touches colder, the whispers louder. At times they could see their breath in the air, the temperature dropping with the rise in supernatural activity. Lucas, his logical mind struggling to make sense of the inexplicable, poised a theory.
Maybe it's testing us, challenging our resolve. We can't let it feed off our fear.
The cabin became a battleground, a place where the physical and spiritual realms collided. With each passing moment, the line between reality and nightmare blurred further, leaving them in a state of constant vigilance and dread. As dawn finally began to break, a fragile sense of relief washed over them. The night's horrors receded, but the scars they left behind were deep and lasting. The forest power was no longer a legend. It was a terrifying reality that had pushed them to the brink of madness. Back at the town, Nathan, having returned from the unsuccessful search, stood up.
This isn't just our imagination. Something is happening in the forest. My sister and her friends are still out there, and whatever is happening to them is affecting the town.
His words struck a chord, and a murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. The old stories, long dismissed as folklore, were being reconsidered. Tales of the forest guardian, a spirit of nature both protective and wrathful, were recounted with newfound belief. The realization that their town was intrinsically linked to the ancient forest and its mysteries was unsettling. The barrier between legend and reality was eroding, and the townsfolk found themselves confronting a truth they had long chosen to ignore. As the meeting descended into a frenzy of fear and speculation, the mayor struggled to restore order, but the seeds of terror has been sown. The town, once a haven of peace and simplicity, was now a community on the edge, its connection to the forest a source of dread. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sounds of whispers. The trees swayed ominously, their branches casting ghostly shadows on the streets. The night was no longer a time of restful silence. It was a time for vigilance and fear. Back in the forest, the group in the cabin felt the intensity of the night's horrors begin to wane as dawn approached, but they knew their ordeal was far from over. They were entangled in something ancient and powerful, a force that extended beyond the forest and into the heart of Eldridge Hollow. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, the group prepared to face another day in the forest, armed with the knowledge of their ritual and unsettling truth of their connection to the town's fate. The boundary between the supernatural and their reality had been irrevocably blurred, and they knew that the coming day would bring new challenges, both from the forest and from within themselves. As the first light of dawn seeped through the trees, painting the forest with pale golden hue, the group emerged from the cabin, a new resolve etched into their weary faces. Despite the terrors of the night, they had decided they would complete the ritual. It was a desperate plan, born out of the realization that their survival and perhaps the safety of Eldridge Hollow depended on it. The book, with its torn pages and cryptic instructions, was their only guide. According to the text, the ritual required specific items, each representing elements of the earth, offerings to appease the guardian of the forest. They split up, scouring the forest for these items. Emma searched for a stone that bore the markings of the ancient symbols they had seen. Lucas gathered water from a nearby stream. Zoe collected leaves and twigs from the oldest trees, and Michael, with reluctance, captured a small forest creature. As they gathered the items, a heavy sense of dread hung over them. The forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath, watching their every move. They regrouped at the cabin, laying out their findings with a mixture of fear and determination. The mental preparation was harder. They sat in a circle, the book opened in front of them, and tried to clear their minds of fear and doubt. Emma spoke softly, trying to bolster their spirits.
We can do this. We have to believe we can.
Lucas nodded, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes.
We've made it this far. We'll see this through together.
Zoe clutched the leaves in her hand, her expression one of fierce resolve.
Whatever happens, we're not giving up. Not now, not ever.
Michael, usually the light-hearted one, looked solemn.
Let's just hope this works.
With everything in place, they made their way to the chapel. The forest seemed to watch them pass, morning light doing little to dispel the sense of foreboding that clung to the trees. Arriving at the chapel, they found it just as they had left it, a relic of forgotten time, its walls echoing with the whispers of the past. The altar stood at the center, waiting for them. They positioned the items they had collected on the altar, each placement deliberate and careful. The book's instructions were vague, but they followed them as closely as they could, their movements synchronized in a silent, unspoken agreement. As they completed their preparations, the air in the chapel grew colder, the shadows deeper, the sense of impending presence grew stronger, the forest outside the chapel stirring as if in anticipation. In the dim light of the chapel, the group stood around the altar, their faces etched with a mix of fear and resolve. Emma, holding the book open to the page of the ritual, began to recite the words. They were in a language none of them understood, ancient and rhythmic, resonating in the air with a power that seemed to vibrate through the chapel. As she spoke, the others joined in, their voices united in the chant. The air around them began to shimmer, a tangible sense of energy building in the room. The items on the altar vibrated, aligning them with the rhythm of their voices. Lucas, his voice steady despite trembling in his hands, poured the water from the stream in a circle around the altar. Zoe placed the leaves and twigs in specific patterns, her movements precise and deliberate. Michael, with a hesitant hand, released a small creature they had captured, which scurried away into the corner of the chapel. The chapel itself seemed to respond to the ritual. The walls vibrated softly, the faded paintings glowing faintly with an ethereal light. The shadows cast by the candlelight grew longer, twisting into shapes that had defied logic. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the chapel, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. In the pitch black, the chanting grew louder, more insistent. A sense of something ancient and powerful filled the air, a presence that was at once terrifying and awe-inspiring. Then, without warning, the entity made itself known. A figure materialized before the altar, its form vague and shifting, a being of shadows and whispers. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the chapel with a sense of ageless power. Emma continued to chant, her voice unwavering, even as the entity grew closer. The air crackled with energy, the boundary between their world and something else thinning. The entity spoke, its voice a chorus of whispers that echoed in their minds.
Why do you summon me?
It asked, its tone neither hostile nor friendly, but infinitely curious. Emma, gathering all her courage, replied,
We seek to complete the ritual, to honor the pact and protect the forest and the town.
The entity seemed to consider her words, its form swirling and changing.
And what do you offer?
It asked, its presence pressing in on them, almost suffocating. Each member of the group stepped forward, offering their personal sacrifices, a cherished memory, a deeply held fear, a secret hope. Each offering was intangible but powerful, a piece of their soul, given willingly. As the ritual reached its climax, the chapel was filled with blinding light. The entity, now a towering figure of light and shadows, accepted the offerings. With a final deafening rush of wind, it vanished, the chapel returning to its silent, somber state. The group collapsed, exhausted but alive. The ritual was complete, but the cost was more than they had anticipated. They had touched something beyond their understanding, a power that was old as the forest itself. As the group struggled to regain their composure in the aftermath of the ritual, the sound of hurried footsteps approached the chapel. Nathan, leading the remnants of the search party, bursting through the chapel door, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief.
Nathan,
Emma exclaimed, relief washing over her at the sight of her brother. Nathan, taking in the scene before him, the dimly lit chapel, the exhausted teenagers, the remnants of the ritual still evident in the altar, struggled to comprehend what had just transpired.
What happened here? Are you all okay?
Lucas, still catching his breath, replied,
We did it, Nathan. We completed the ritual.
The search party, a motley group of townsfolk, hesitantly stepped inside, their eyes darting around the ancient chapel, The tension in the air was palpable, a mixture of relief at finding the teenagers and an unease at the evident otherworldliness of the situation. Nathan approached the altar, his gaze falling upon the items laid out upon it.
This was to stop whatever was happening in the forest?
Emma nodded, her voice soft.
Yes, we had to. It was the only way to appease the guardian of the forest and protect Eldridge Hollow.
The members of the search party exchanged glances, the reality of the situation sinking in. The old stories they had heard about the forest, tales passed down through generations, had come to life before their very eyes. One of the townsfolk, an elderly man who had lived in Eldridge Hollow his entire life, stepped forward.
You've done what many of us never had the courage to do. You've faced the forest's heart.
The atmosphere in the chapel shifted as the townsfolk began to understand the magnitude of what the teenagers had accomplished. The fear that had gripped them was slowly replaced by a newfound respect for the forest and its mysteries. Nathan put his arm around Emma, his relief evident.
I'm just glad you're safe. You've all been through so much.
As the group began to make their way out of the chapel, the sun rose higher, casting its light through the broken windows. The forest, which had been a source of fear and mystery, now seemed almost peaceful, its secrets momentarily quieted. The convergence of the teenagers and the search party in the chapel marked a moment of shared understanding and transformation. They had not only found each other, but had also discovered a deeper connection to the ancient spirit of the forest and the town's heritage. In the quiet light of the morning, as the group and the search party made their way out of the chapel, the air in the forest felt different, as if a great burden had been lifted. The once oppressive atmosphere was now lighter, almost serene, but the cost of what they had done lingered in their hearts and minds. As they walked, the teenagers were introspective, each lost in their own thoughts. They had faced unimaginable horrors and made personal sacrifices that no one else could truly understand. The entity had demanded parts of their essence, memories, fears, hopes, and each felt a sense of loss, a void those parts had been. Emma walked beside Nathan, her steps heavy.
It's over, but it doesn't feel like it's really over.
She confessed, her voice tinged with weariness. Nathan looked at her, his expression one of concern and pride.
You did something incredible, Emma. You all did. But it's okay to feel lost after something like this.
Lucas, overhearing their conversation, added,
We faced our fears, our own selves in a way. It's going to take time to understand what that really means.
The group's arrival back at Eldridge Hollow was met with a mixture of relief and awe from the townsfolk. Whispered conversations filled the air, a blend of admiration for the teenagers' bravery and a renewed sense of respect for the forest's mysteries. In the days that followed, the teenagers grappled with the aftermath of their experience. They were hailed as heroes by some and regarded as cautious curiosity by the others. The ritual had been successful in appeasing the guardian and protecting the town, but the scars it left were not just physical. Emma found herself dreaming of the chapel and the entity, her sleep restless and filled with the echoes of the forest whispers. Lucas dove into research, trying to understand more about the ancient rites and the legends they had become a part of. Zoe, usually so full of energy, became more reflective, often seen gazing towards the forest's edge, and Michael, who had always found humour in everything, now carried a more sombre air, his jokes fewer and tinged with sadness. The entity had retreated, his presence no longer a looming threat, but its impact remained. The experience had changed them in ways they were still trying to comprehend. The lines between reality and myth, between fear and bravery, had been blurred, leaving them to wonder about the true nature of the world they live in and their place within it. As they navigated their new reality, they found solace in each other, the shared experience binding them in a way that nothing else could. They had ventured into the unknown, faced the embodiment of ancient powers, and emerged changed. The forest, once a place of mystery and fear, now held a different meaning for them all, a reminder of their journey, their sacrifices, and their strength.